Before we get started, I wanted to give a brief background about the Sasaki Foundation. 20 years ago, the Hideo Sasaki Foundation was established by Sasaki, a multidisciplinary design firm, and it included a bequest from the family of Hideo Sasaki, who was an internationally renowned landscape architect, admired for his teaching, critical abilities, and his multidisciplinary approach to design. And over the past 20 years, the foundation has sponsored students, studios, symposiums throughout the country with the goal of advancing the value of design while inviting and collaborating with diverse partners to co-create change. And today, the Sasaki Foundation carries forward Hideo's legacy by blurring the boundaries to co-create change and shape the built environment. We are thrilled to be celebrating 20 years of fostering equity and inclusion and making collective impact in the community. With that, I would like to turn it over to Nadine Worth from Landscape Forms, our sponsor for the evening, who is going to say a few words before we kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Alexandra. Hello, everyone, and Landscape Forms could not be more honored than to be sponsoring this event this evening. Landscape Forms is a leader in the integrated solutions of high design site furnishings, advanced LED lighting, structure, and the custom environments. For more than 50 years, since 1969, Landscape Forms has been developing and creating solutions that help designers and their clients achieve beautiful, functional landscapes that enhance the experience of the outdoors. The outdoors is for everyone, and they should be built to be inclusive and accessible to everyone. I have been fortunate in the last 15 years of my career to work with many, if not all, landscape architects at Sasaki on a wide range of multifaceted projects that are inherent in those core values. My favorite projects with Sasaki are the parks, all the way from California, the Wilmington Waterfront Park, to Cincinnati, the Small Riverfront Park. And the most current project we're working on with Sasaki is the Boston City Hall Plaza. With our stated purpose at Landscape Forms is to enrich outdoor spaces, our environmental stewardship is who we are at Landscape Forms. In the way, we carefully design and create the environment, create products that not only can handle the environment, but we carefully considers the way our products and our practices impede the environment. Sustainability and stewardship are not just consistent with our company values, but they are at the core of them. Design, culture, and craft are the three pillars of the cores of Landscape Forms and create a strong sense of environmental stewardship and accountability for the company. It's a company I'm very proud to work with. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nadine. And thank you again to Landscape Forms for sponsoring tonight's event. Now, if we were in the incubator at Sasaki, I would say help yourself to drinks and food throughout the discussion, and the bathrooms are down the hall. But since you're all at home, you're on your own for that. Finally, throughout the discussion, feel free to send questions you may have for Chief Crockett and Mary Anne in the chat. And Alicia will feed these questions to them both when it's time for audience Q&A. Now, I'm going to hand this over to Mary Anne Ocampo, who will kick off tonight's discussion.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see everyone on the screen. My name is Mary Anne Ocampo, and I am the board chair of the Sasaki Foundation and a principal at Sasaki. We're looking forward to a really dynamic conversation with Chief Crockett tonight on co-creating equitable cities. And I'm going to just briefly give a description of tonight's event. We're going to pretty much work it so that we have about 30 minutes of conversation, and then we'll leave the last bit so we have about 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience, who we know probably has a lot of questions for Chief Crockett. Chief Crockett is the author of People Before Highways, Boston Activists, Urban Planners, a new movement for city making, a book that tells the local story of the grassroots movement in the late 1960s that stopped the construction of a 12-lane highway that would have cut through the heart of the city's Black and Brown communities. The story that we know today with this incredible movement and this victory is the Southwest Corridor Park, a 4.5 or 4.7 mile linear park running alongside the MBTA Orange Line, linking a lot of neighborhoods together. So Chief Crockett is also faculty at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. This summer, Chief Crockett was appointed by Mayor Walsh to head the newly created Office of Equity, a cabinet-level post for the city of Boston. Chief Crockett is charged with leading the administration's efforts to embed equity into all city work and actively work to dismantle racism by putting an intentional focus on supporting communities of color and marginalized groups and building governmental structures to sustain this work. We are so happy to have you with us, Chief Crockett. And I don't know if there's any other words that you'd like to add to that introduction.
No, just
Great.
tremendous thanks, Mary Anne. So kind and warm. Thank you.
So Chief Crockett, just to get the conversation started, we wanted to know a little bit more about your past. You've been a native of Boston growing up in Dorchester, and this new role as Chief of Equity must be especially important to you. How does the role have personal meaning for you?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And first and foremost, thank you to the entire community that's assembled here. And thank you to Sasaki for just having us together. The foundation's work is so important. Alexandra, just your leadership and your vision for how to make this night special is appreciated and received. And so Mary Anne and I are friends or colleagues and from the MIT world. So it's nice to just bring in some of that faculty meeting spirit and some of our sideline conversation to more of a public forum. So very happy to be here and engage. And just, honestly, tremendous respect and admiration for the idea of co-designing, co-building, the idea that there's a co. It feels critical and feels like an invitation to really kind of rethink what we're talking about and who gets to be a part of it. So for me, as the Chief of Equity, this is a part of my job, is to think about what are all the things we can and must do together. What does that mean in terms of the structures that we create, governmental structures, social structures, political structures, and to really kind of be about that work. So Mary Anne, you're right. I mean, I am local. This is home. I'm homegrown. Boston is where I was born and raised. I'm from Dorchester. Many of you who know Dorchester know that it's the best neighborhood, the biggest neighborhood, the most beautiful neighborhood, the most diverse neighborhood, the most green neighborhood, all of that. So we could just start with the basics. And so I think when you have the good fortune to be born in a neighborhood like that, you start with understanding that we can actually share space. We can share a city. We can speak many different languages. We can come from different countries. We can come from different parts of even the United States, like my family did. My family left West Virginia in the 50s and came to Boston, like many Black families from the South looking for new opportunity in the North. They didn't really find that in Boston. They came with a lot of hope and optimism, but then experienced a lot of disappointment. And so my experience of growing up in the city is very much influenced by my family's own experience as a Black family, trying to make Boston work, and being really disappointed. And then I'm also of a generation of folks who were born on the other side of the busing controversy. So I was born in the 70s, right as busing was happening. School desegregation in Boston is a trauma in terms of a failed moment of racial reconciliation. And so there is quite a bit of trauma and disappointment that has influenced the way I understand the city. But on the other side of that, the incredible legacy of resistance, of organizing, of new visions of what power sharing can be and what the city is meant to be. And so my family also stands in that kind of a witness. And that's something that has very much influenced my academic interests, my career of just research, but also in this new role. This new role that the mayor has created was born also in a moment of trauma. So when the mayor reached out to me to talk about this role as the Chief of Equity, he called me on a fateful summer night in June and started to talk very clearly and directly about George Floyd's murder. and what that would mean for the city of Boston to try to be more intentional and focused on racial justice and equity. And the mayor had in mind creating a part of government that could be not only informed by this, but could be a part of transforming even some of the values of his administration. So he talked very candidly about what it means to be a mayor in this moment of racial reckoning and what it means to be a white mayor. And so there is a cost and a call that's on the table. And part of my role is to make sure that we're answering that call, not just as an individual or as a resident myself, but that government and our mayor is in a real conversation that pushes all of us to do some real reckoning and some real work, not just around equity for right now, but this generational focus. So maybe a bigger answer to a small question that you had, Mary Anne, but I'm so excited to engage with this community in particular because I feel like there's a commitment to thinking about not just what is beautiful and what we can make to look at, but understanding power as a vector for translating and understand what can truly be sustainable and beautiful in a sense of inclusion and also as an act of justice. Marianne, you're speaking, I think, but you are muted and I want to hear all of it.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Don't mute yourself.
Okay, voices need to be heard. Okay, no one should be muted. No,
that's right.
Or silenced, I should say.
Right.
This is great to hear. Thank you, Chief Crockett, and giving a sense of your role and this kind of inertia and momentum that has built up. With the murder of George Floyd, and just understanding that there's a time of racial reckoning. We're in a tumultuous time of a public health crisis. We're seeing really specific populations that are disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic, racism, economic exclusion, there are racial wealth gaps, a lack of affordable housing, there's a digital divide, a global pandemic where essential workers are having to go to work because if not, they can't pay their bills. We're clearly needing to focus on, a new normal, a better normal that is really about an equity-driven normal. What are some lessons learned that you're finding through this pandemic experience that we think, can help us plan for the future? Are there any lessons learned that you're finding on the ground right now?
Such a great question. There's so many lessons right now. I feel that cities are at the edge of how they understand what governance looks like right now. The COVID pandemic has pushed all of us, and particularly folks who live in cities and city governments, to figure out how can they keep their populations literally alive? How can they think about what it means to step into a tremendous void and vacuum that exists because we still do not have a national or federal plan for how to fight the COVID pandemic. And so what you're seeing is all of these municipal leaders scrambling to stand in the gap and roll out comprehensive public health strategies, but also recovery models. So what I'm seeing is a city government in Boston of more than 50 plus departments, 18,000 employees, folks who've been working around the clock for the last 7 months to figure out how to get this thing right. But also, how do we think about this equitable recovery? Because all of what we know is that the COVID pandemic has just revealed, right? This is how we talk about it, and I revealed all of these not only underlying conditions of populations that have to do with mortality and morbidity, but also revealed so many of the so much environmental racism, so many social determinants of health that have caused so many of these populations to be vulnerable. So we have work to do there. And I feel that many mayors around the country that we speak to, we were just on a call with a few mayors yesterday and trying to think about, again, what does this new model of governing or creating or rebuilding or recovery work and healing work in a city look like? And people are trying to figure this out in real time. Even as we all see, even right now, the numbers, we've seen an uptick in COVID positivity over the last couple of days. And so this thing is very much a moving target. And so there are real implications for what it means to imagine new governmental structures. And so even the role of Chief of Equity as a cabinet level position is meant to signal and truly be this change in structure. And so there are about a dozen or so chiefs of equity around the country, still kind of a relatively new idea, but really represents progressive mayors trying to imagine how to express their values in ways that are driving systemic change and transformation. So the rubber will meet the road and is meeting the road now. And I really have to call on all of you to hold the city of Boston and other cities accountable on this moment of saying, okay, well, you're saying you're about equity, but let's kind of see what that looks and feels like for so many populations that need real change and have been asking for it for much longer than the timeline we're on in the wake of George Floyd's murder.
That, the accountability that you talk about, and knowing that you can't just talk about it, you have to do something, and it's going to be in your decision making, and everything that you are reflecting on. I think that we're seeing, this public health crisis, it's national in scale, and to hear what, municipal governments are doing, how is the city of Boston, and with your role as chief of equity, how does municipal government do differently? What can we do differently to better equip and protect vulnerable populations? Mm-hmm. Are there policy interventions that are addressing existing disparities right now? Mm-hmm. That we can talk through? Are there policy interventions that are forward-looking that you think are going to come down the pipeline with what you're seeing?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is, and you alluded to it, Mary Anne, was this calling out of racism is so, it seems so simple, or maybe in some ways a no-brainer, but it's actually pretty significant. So when the mayor declared racism a public health crisis in June, that continues to be a sort of a catalyzing moment for so much work that not only I'm doing, but folks around the city are doing. And so this need to call out what's happening or call a thing is really significant, particularly in a city like Boston, where that has not always been our tradition. And certainly in City Hall, calling out the fact that City Hall often has not been on the winning side of history, to say the least, either whether it has to do with school desegregation, or even the famed story of the West End and what that textbook example of clearance and displacement meant for the 20,000 families who lost their homes through the West End's clearance. These are ways that by not having an equity focused or an equity lens, or having a clear sense of a commitment to racial justice or racism as a design principle as well. So I talk about racism as a particular kind of logic for organizing society based on a hierarchy of race. And so as emotional and as upsetting as racism can be sometimes when we talk about it, it's important to understand that it's an organizing feature or principle. And so how to call this out as a type of social toxin, as a disease, as a public health crisis, something to be rooted out, gives us a way to come to understanding. And so your question about what is a particular policy or a particular sense of direction for writing the city or writing ourselves, I think it does really start out with this moment of truth telling. And so I may have shared this story with Mary Anne. I talked about when the mayor announced my appointment and the end of June, it came with a press conference, which I did not know or expect. I'd never had a job that came with a press conference or being on TV. So that was very unusual, a little bit disorienting. And what was notable about it is that I was asked to give a few remarks, and I said this was like my first time outside the house during the pandemic. I had been nestled in the house for about 3 months by that point, and so the idea of going outside to City Hall was like very shocking, and I had to try to pull out my clothes and figure out where my regular outside clothes were. And I think at the time I had to try to get a haircut. It was a lot of things to do in 2 or 3 days. And so I went and they asked me to give a few remarks, and I said, about what? And they said, just, what you think the job will be like, and, what you want to do. And I remember standing there, and there weren't a lot of folks because City Hall was closed for the most part then. And I said that for far too long, Boston City Hall has been an agent of racism and had been a gatekeeper of sort of old crony relationships, and sort of holding the city's prosperity and power. Kind of that sentence happened. And I didn't think it was anything but an observation and something to just kind of, that many of us would know is a thing. What I was not prepared for was the response, the public reaction to that statement. And then calls started coming, and text messages, and small videos of people sort of saying things, and it resulted in the actual death of my phone. My phone completely fried out, my little cell phone, and it stopped working, and I had to buy a new phone, and it was very disorienting. And I share that story because some of what caused this dismantling of my phone was people calling and saying that they were so overwhelmed and relieved to hear this moment of naming or truth telling. And there were people who actually were crying inside my phone, some people that I knew, some people I didn't know. But I took it as a barometer of kind of where we are as a city, and people's thirst and desire to have a moment of reckoning, and again, truth telling. So I was very unprepared for that level of response and engagement, but the honesty of people's reaction told me a lot about where we are and some of what I need to be about in the job. So just connecting that back to the work, the mayor's declaration of calling out racism as a public health crisis and emergency is a call to action. And some of that story, so the anecdotes of what it means to be in Boston, a city that has a very tortured and traumatic history, not unlike other cities. But sometimes our distinction is in not calling out that story or speaking to it with true language, true direct language that can allow us to name. And I don't know if you ever move on fully, because my family itself still has a lot of stories to tell, and scars, but there's no way to at least try to move forward or build alongside that without without calling out what we have experienced and what we won't allow again in many instances.
Well, I think the truth telling and just, so many, I think the relief of feeling like someone can speak it and say it. And it's been for so long something that can't be said because people didn't, feel like they had the power where others could receive it and change could happen. I think it's interesting to know that your impact already with folks who were relieved that you were saying it out loud, and that could be something that gives hope and inspires other people to feel like they too can speak up and say something is really, really amazing. When I think about, a lot of people on the phone or on the screen are residents of Greater Boston, or they're planners or designers or organizers. What can we do in regards to truth telling? What can we do to help in regards to dismantling, racism and the work that we're doing in our everyday lives, as far as any advice from what you're seeing that you think would be helpful for others?
think for all of us, we have to open up ourselves to listening and sharing those big decision-making tables. And so when I was working on the research for the People Before Highways book that you mentioned, I was really struck by this story of people coming together from across the city of Boston and across the region to make this regional social movement of people who would say, we're going to stop an interstate highway. In the 1960s, at a time where highways were seen as the future, the way to make your city work for so many, were seen as progress, were seen as the ultimate modern urban planning intervention. Oh, how things change, right? But in the moment of the 1960s and 50s, this was kind of the way. The federal interstate highway system was just like the cat's meow. And so in learning more about that story and in talking to so many planners and organizers and activists, I was struck by what it means to live into your highest values. And even when you think you're going to lose, or you know you're going to lose. When I talk to Fred Salvucci or Tani Lee or Mel King or Chuck Turner and Hirschfang, all of these heroes, people are clapping. These are the, the folks. And they mostly said they didn't think they could win in trying to fight this highway thing. They thought, Chuck Turner said to me, you don't fight a highway because you think you're going to win. You fight these things because you feel like you must, because in some way they violate what you think is important, your sense of justice, your sense of place, your sense of the plan that you envision. And so in imagining a bigger table and a bigger set of dreams, the question is always how to listen and put ourselves in a place where we are truly doing what the Sasaki family diaspora does, is this act of co-creation, this understanding that it's again the co. And even if you don't think that you may be victorious on the way to living into your values, you have the opportunity to create something unimaginable in the best possible way. And so the highway story, it is always with me because so many of those activists, one, again, they thought there was no way they were going to defeat I-95. There was federal funding, there was state funding, most of the mayors around here were in support of it, yet and still folks meeting in their kitchens and in their basements and on the street and people talking were able to defeat this federal infrastructure, this federal dream. And in so doing, transformed how we think about planning, not just transportation planning, but city planning, how we think about power. They led to so many different organizations coming to life, including JPNDC, including Madison Park, including all of these really important organizations that remain committed to bigger tables, more informed and progressive politics about what it means to make place and to create place that's sustainable and informed by residents. So before I get on my soapbox about technocrats and the danger that we all face by thinking that we have all the answers, we have the best drawings, if people would just listen to us so we could get it right. I think the fact that we're sitting here in this incredible anniversary of Sasaki is really a testament to what it means to kind of hold true to some values that that matter and that often kind of put you on a different side of the calculus of a government calculus, of a balance sheet calculus. How can we really think about some of the bigger, hairier, much more complicated questions of really centering populations who have been decentered, who have been erased, who've experienced disinvestment and displacement. And then we get to have stories that show us what actually is possible when we dare to say no, And sometimes we have to.
That's wonderful to hear. I think, our founder, Hideo Sasaki, said contribution is the only value. And so for us, the contribution I'm just thinking about is just listening. Like, instead of, predetermining a solution or right now, to listen is a contribution in the way that we do our work. You talk about, I'm thinking like of the role of planning and the way that we are seeing big data and the way that we're integrating data into our work as a tool. And there's certain biases that are built into data. Do you have any ideas on how you think about how we can approach data as a tool of inequity, to reduce inequity, I should say, in something in which we can talk about accessibility, we can tell untold stories from our past, that we were learning from our past. We had some good history, we had some not so great history, but we're learning from that history. If we think about data and how we're utilizing it and planning today, how can we understand those biases in data, and how can they, move us to serve the populations that we want to work with in regards to thinking about equity and impactful outcomes?
In the case of the highway fight as well, I think about something as simple as a desire line from transportation, right? It's a very simple idea that you're here, but you want to go there, or you're there and you want to go over there. And so those intentions that you set make a directionality, right? And all of you guys that do the transportation planning work, you can talk about desire lines all day and how they begin to suggest the route for a road or the route for a bridge or something that doesn't exist. How do you get people from one place to the next? Seemingly simple, pretty direct. But the question becomes, again, what are you measuring and why? So why this direction and for whom? In the highway fight, that was this essential metric or measure that became contested for people living in the city saying, well, I live in JP or I live in Roxbury and I need to get to Mattapan, or I need to get to downtown. Well, the traffic planners and thinking about the desire lines for this, well, we're not thinking about that. They were thinking about if you live in Dedham and you want to come to downtown, how could we help you do that? Or if you're in Peabody and you want to go west, how do you do that? And so by asking the simple question of what are you measuring, then for whom, you actually start to get inside of the politics, sometimes the preferences, sometimes the biases that on the surface can be presented as universal desires, even in the case of a desire line. And I think as we continue to imagine questions around big data, or even data's usefulness as a good planning tool, we owe it to ourselves not to be dazzled by what it means to look at data sets and how, or anything that suggests that gives us a sense of what to do. These data sets still contain values, judgment calls, that preference, typically somebody, and the question is, who do you want to prioritize or preference as users or beneficiaries? And can we be a little more honest and transparent about that? And for so many powerful activist movements, this is kind of the special sauce, which is that analysis of what it is that we're talking about. I think quite a lot about civil rights history in organizing, and even the Black Power movement, and what these interventions mean, not only in terms of expanding our notion of citizenship and freedom, but also space. I wonder how the civil rights movement also helps us to rethink and consider who is entitled to what space and when, and why is that a question that is fragmented or defined often by race and gender and class. And so if we take it back to even the story of our sort of opening reference to George Floyd, a question could be asked about what was it about where George Floyd was and when, and also the reach and overreach of the police and the police state that allowed this encounter in front of this convenience store to happen. And that is a function of law and planning and race. And so even as we think through, again, policies and measures and design, we are all implicated in these types of interactions. It's easy to demonize an agency or an entity, but it's obviously much more complicated than that.
Thank you. I know that we have some folks who have some questions that they want to ask you, or Alicia's going to be starting to feed in some questions for those of you who I know there's a couple that have come through the chat. So if you have any more questions, feel free to put those in there. I think that I guess I'll end my last question before we move to the Q&A from the audience is just thinking about accountability and how we can be accountable in regards to understanding our role in the world and, you know, whatever your profession or wherever you live, and how there's these critical intersections between law, planning, and politics, and so many other aspects, and knowing that we're participating in that. I think that, you know, how can we hold policymakers and designers and planners accountable for equity outcomes? You know, I think a lot of audience members would be interested in knowing how we can start to hold folks accountable, including ourselves.
Such a good question. I think I start with the reminder to myself whenever I have a policy conversation that policy is only ever about two things. You're either encouraging people to do something or discouraging them. So policy as a tool for shaping behavior and decisions is either one way or the other. And so as someone who studies policy, who writes about it, who is in a position of making policy, it is really important, again, to remember that piece of the work. And then also, again, who is it that we're intending to benefit, or who decides and in whose interest is this work? That's a famous Mel King question. Mel King would always ask the question, in whose interest? It feels appropriate since Mel King's birthday was yesterday, I believe. So he's here with us. And so by trying to make clear that kind of intention, it's crucial. And then I would say your point about accountability is, for me, is about advocates and organizing. And I think about how important it is, like I said, to have those tables where people are really sort of battling out what to do. Because if someone on the call has an example of how and when the benevolence of a governor or a mayor or a president led to exactly what we needed, I'd love to hear it, because typically that is not the case. What is the case is someone's hand was forced over time through very fiery interactions, confrontations, late night discussions, mobilizing direct actions that had led to some of the most important policies that we have in Boston. I mean, I can call out many of the battles around linkage and what that policy has meant in terms of clawing out benefit for folks across the city. I can think about the Boston Resident Jobs Policy as another example of the Boston Jobs Coalition's more than 30 years of work to make sure the development can result in jobs that are meant for residents of the city, people of color and women, to make sure that when there is development, that there's an accountability, or there's an understanding that local people are meant to benefit from economic growth and development in the city. That's a policy that continues to be cited around the country, though we have more work to do for sure to strengthen it, to make sure it has the oversight, accountability, and support it needs. But nonetheless, the policy as an example of organizing and mobilizing in a way to create a structure, a behavioral incentive in the government that is tied to economic development is an example of that kind of agitation. And so for me, I don't come to this as someone who believes if you read a bunch of books and you make a nice graph, it all is well. You know, again, that's kind of cautioning us from being lured into the false idea that sort of a technocratic or an academic orientation to the messiness of governing is going to get it done. It has to be about people being very confrontational and pushing for what we know. And so I assume this role as Chief Equity Officer, understand the role as a pressure point. I understand the role as something you do not take on if you have a thin skin. You gotta be ready for that rumble, because on the end, that's how we get something better. It doesn't always feel good in the moment, but it has so much to do with how we have to understand co-governance. And that's something that I firmly believe in. It's something that the mayor ran on. It is something that he also has dedicated a career of service to. So that's the work before us. And planners and designers, you have an important role here too, to really ask us to think more deeply about values, about land values. There's a deeper question in here about the commodification of land and the way that that constrains, or seems like it constrains, what our choices are. And I challenge us to think into how we can push against that commodification of just living in the city, even in the United States. And that's the battle here. And folks who have an international background or who have lived elsewhere outside of the United States, as I have, we can offer up different questions on that too, which are important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chief Crockett. I think we're going to pivot now to some questions from the audience. Alicia's going to be giving us some of those.
Yes, thank you, Mary Anne, and thank you, Chief Crockett. This has been an excellent discussion so far. We've had a bunch of questions in the chat, and I've also got some directly to me, so I'll try to just get to as many as we can. Chief Crockett, what do you see as the single largest gap in equity within the city? And if it's different, what do you see as the most challenging gap to close?
Yeah, for me, I have really put a special focus on the racial wealth gap as an issue that centers and anchors my portfolio and some of the work I will be doing and continue to do in partnership with Mayor Walsh. And so many of you know the data, you saw the data even coming out of Boston Federal Reserve Bank in 2015, the Color of Wealth report shared with us some really staggering data. And much of that was picked up by the Boston Globe Spotlight series and left us with points like this: $247,000 as the median wealth for a white family, $8 for a Black family. And so there's something to be said about how closing that gap is something we can't quite seem to address. And buried inside there is a longer legacy and story of systemic racism, chattel slavery, and where that leaves us by having a population of people who have basically contributed 400 years of free labor that has enriched the country. So how do we speak to that? And how do we think about the repair and restoration of this population, but also what that means in terms of generational wealth building, mobility. These are issues in terms of McKinsey's report that came out last year and talked about basically what that means in terms of the US GDP. I think the calculation is $1.5 trillion lost in GDP based on this suppression of wealth and income productivity by race. And so the racial wealth gap for me is something that we have to throw our shoulder to the wheel on. It's not something that is easily addressed or resolved at the municipal level. It is certainly a global and even a national issue, but there is work that we can, should, and must do at the municipal level.
Okay, so Timothy asked a question. We kind of covered the first part of his question, so maybe I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll jump to the second part, which another question for you, Chief Crockett. what is your vision of the participatory process that enables generational change for how people can live in the city, whether it's through education, healthcare, public spaces, mobility, et cetera?
So Alicia, the question is, what's the first part again?
What is your vision of a participatory process that may happen that will enable generational change for how people live in the city through these different means?
Yeah, be careful with a question like that because I'm also a history lover and a historian. So the first thing I'm going to say is we need to know kind of the stories. We need to kind of figure out a fun, engaging, and ongoing way to know kind of how we got here. So when I think about participation, the first word that comes up for me is ownership and stewardship. And I can say this to you as someone who grew up in Boston, and I really didn't know anything about kind of these stories of organizing or resistance that I told you about. I didn't know anything about the anti-highway fight. I didn't know anything about these tremendous stories of the fight for Tent City or Via Victoria, or so much organizing across the city, not just in terms of housing and open space, but a whole population of folks, Puerto Rican families, African American families. I could think about like the power of so many Chinese and Asian families in the South End, in Chinatown, who have really helped breathe life into powerful progressive visions for how the city can be and what that means. And to know that for, I don't know, 22 years, basically, I hadn't heard of that. I grew up in the city feeling like that the city was just so closed and so disappointing and so not about me. You know, I started with saying how much Dorchester pride I have. And that's real and that's true. Notice I didn't say Boston pride. You know, I didn't say I'm a Bostonian. Even when I say that, that still seems like a strange thing to say, not because it's not true, but because the way that I experience as so many young people who grew up in the neighborhoods, that sense of ownership that the city has of you, that you have of it, there's something that's still not, that still needs to be reconsidered there for us. So for me, history and knowing the stories of agency and power of communities of color, of Black and brown populations that were my neighbors, I just felt like the city was a place where we didn't have an option. We didn't have a chance. We weren't a part of it. And to know that there's all of this stories of planning and organizing and city making that is the opposite, that is very much about owning and participating and being theorists and strategists and planners, even if you are a resident who doesn't have a lot of money, or maybe English is not your first language. That doesn't mean you're not a powerful planner, even if you're not trained in that way, or you're not a designer. You live and you try to make your life work from one day to the next. That makes you a planner, as far as I'm concerned. You know, you try to figure out how to take care of your family, how to make your life work. You're a designer. So how to kind of put the power back into these conversations starts with letting people know what the full story is. And again, the truth telling piece is absolutely instrumental and vital to our participation quest. So some of you know, just real quick, I started a nonprofit that was working with high school students called My Town. I did that work for nearly 10 years. That was my foundational work when I was young, working with young people to help them learn the stories of their families and communities and what it meant to be a family that was living in Boston in the 60s and 70s. You know, there are some families that we heard everyone did not go to the suburbs with all the white families when all the families of color were here. And even poor white families were in the city trying to make the city work when the city was losing population, when the city was losing its tax base. Those legacy populations have to be sort of acknowledged and spoken to. And so the organizational work I was doing was about that. And it has been important work for me in terms of an orientation, but also understanding what does it mean to get people really connected to their own power, to not only participate, but to steward, own, lead, and control where they live. That's how we get sustainability, to me.
Yeah, definitely. So this question's from Fatima, and it kind of addresses the lending to address the wealth gap. So there was a recent paper from MIT's Center for Finance and Policy that speaks directly to the fact that Black Americans pay more for home ownership than any other group. And they break it down to 3 factors: risk pool lending, higher insurance premiums, and higher property taxes. And these policy can be changed by those who make them, for example, banks and insurance companies. So as the Chief Equity Officer, is there a way for you to make the policy recommendation to the mayor that will basically ask the banks or tell the banks that the city will remove funds out of those banks that will not change their policies? Fatima's asking because she wants to see change within this lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Fatima, thank you for the question. This is a setup question because Fatima is on the steering committee of the Racial Equity Fund, and we should probably take her off mute so she can respond. But I think that the question is really about how is it the city and the mayor and the bully pulpit, honestly, of City Hall can be a center of gravity for informing not only the policies inside of city government, but how is it that our decisions and our values as a reflection of the electorate can also influence folks who are in the private sector, folks who are in the education world and in the healthcare world, which is definitely a part of sort of my orientation. And so that's the work that we must do. And we're frankly concerned about this moment, Fatima, and what that means for the financial industry and what it means for our economy. It is no secret to any of us that we are in a moment of belt tightening. And many of us are concerned, especially me, in terms of how we might be moving toward a moment of fiscal austerity. Toward the end of this year, for January, we started out in the beginning of the summer having the highest unemployment rate in the country. In Massachusetts, that is not a distinction that we're proud of or feeling good about. And in that moment, in July and August, we're really asking ourselves questions about what does it mean to know that we're just shedding jobs, and to know that in this moment we have lost so much ground in the hospitality sector, in retail, in a restaurant sector. Our essential workers who are needing these jobs. The question is what are we going to do? And what does that rebuild look like? So again, how we can inform whether the banks or the financial folks around this question around home mortgages and lending, it's important. But I think in what I'm most concerned about is to make sure that equity as a value is informing all of the decisions that we're making, not just now, but especially when we get closer to the cuts. We know they're coming, the cutbacks, that austerity moment. I have colleagues, I know many of you do have colleagues as well in the city of New York, and what's happening in New York government in terms of layoffs and furloughs is very sobering and terrifying. So we're fortunate to be in a bit of a stronger financial positioning in the city of Boston, but that doesn't mean that people are not hurting, and that doesn't mean that there are more decisions that have to be made about what assets people have access to, how they can accumulate additional assets in this moment where everyone is asking the same question. So Fatma, we can take this question offline, or you can offer some more insight in the chat because I feel like you have more to say, but it's a great question, and one that I hope that we can all hold on to, because it's going to be a real test of our values, not only right now, but in the coming months for sure, especially for me, Q1 and Q2 of 2021.
Definitely, and I'll give Fatima a chance to respond in the chat, perhaps, but maybe just in the interest of time, maybe we make this one of the last questions, which are there any lessons we can learn from other cities who have chiefs of equity, if there's anything that you've seen in your time since joining?
Yes, I'm still paying attention. You know, what I found is that I mentioned there about maybe a little bit more than a dozen or so of these chiefs of equity, and everyone has a different kind of flavor and makeup and where they sit. And so we were on a call yesterday with mayors asking this question around economic equity and the question of reparations, and trying to get a listen in on other mayors, the mayor of Asheville, the mayor Alorza in Providence, the mayor of Evanston, Haggerty. These are places that are actively seeking out economic reparations as a way of thinking about restoration and repair from the legacy of slavery of African Americans in this country. And so on the call was Chief Candace Moore, who I secretly and not so secretly fangirl. She's a chief of equity in Chicago, and was someone that we actually talked about in a seminar I taught last year at MIT, as we were trying to think about, well, what does it mean to have a chief of equity? And for the last 2 years, I taught this course, Equity and Inclusion, the graduate course that I created at MIT, and spent 2 years critiquing all these chiefs and saying, these roles don't mean anything. You can't make change by hiring someone, and these programs are real meaning, but they're whatever. And so the joke's on me, because I really spent probably 2 years just like shredding all of these mayors and their chiefs of equity and blah, blah, blah. And here I am, right? So it was really wonderful to be on this call yesterday with Candace Moore and to kind of hear a little bit more about what they're up to in Chicago, and people really trying to figure out how to make this work, not just because they want to, but again, because the voters and the electorate are demanding that government do more, be more, and rethink itself. And so to the extent that chiefs of equity are a winning part of that strategy of thinking about structural reform, of thinking about how to really codify progressive values that are in conversation with activists, with organizers, even with the movement for Black Lives, folks who are really saying very bold and strong and clear things about what needs to happen in the city, how people can be safe, how they can be nourished, taken care of, and have spaces to make bigger dreams real. That's a generational demand that if we do not figure out a way to answer that and to lean into it and take it seriously, then shame on all of us if we find ourselves here again in 5 years and 10 years learning nothing. So I hope that we can all just kind of hold each other and take seriously the need to commit and to speak in clear language about what's wrong and what we want to do about it. Because I think government and so many of us that are in positions of power, or who have been well educated, or what, you just go down the list, our legitimacy is in question, and it should be, because so much of what all of these things represent is how we got here to begin with. So an invitation to think about our commitments to rethink, decentering ourselves, and to just be honest about the opportunity to be raw and vulnerable. I think that's the best thing we can do. And that, I feel like, is a lesson that I came into the role sort of thinking about that. And it has only been emphasized through all of these interactions with other mayors and other chiefs and folks who are trying to think about the same thing. So thanks for that question.
Well, I want to be mindful.
Thank you so much. Mary Anne, yeah, I'll kick it to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I know it's going to be respectful of Chief Crockett's time as well as everyone else's time. Thank you, Nadine from Landscape Forums, to coming by and sponsoring this event and being part of it. I think that everyone in the audience, thank you so much for your questions about this really important topic for our cities and our communities, our country. And thank you, Chief Crockett. I think that your stories of resistance, of hope, of truth telling are so inspirational. We look forward, to working with you, to helping co-create those equitable cities that we live in. And I will say I'm a fangirl. I'm a fangirl of Chief Crockett now. I've always been, but now especially. And hearing you talk about this is just fantastic. And we're really lucky to have you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful. Thank you. So please come visit when you can, come help we need a lot of help. I know to say that because it's true. So thanks everyone, and definitely want to send a special hello to so many of my colleagues from the BPDA that are also on this call and try to do the work. So thanks everyone.